Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling the European Union, specifically its current economic situation and, the social policies that affect so many people.
That's right. And we've got quite a bit to work with. We're looking at the European Commission's autumn 2024 economic forecast, some foundational stuff from Wikipedia and Civitas on EU treaties.
And that ETUI report on social policy from 2023 gives a good social angle.
Exactly. So the idea is to, pull out the really key trends, the big challenges, and how the EU is responding.
Right. We know you want the core insights without getting bogged down. So our mission is basically to connect these dots for you, make sense of it all.
Make it feel less like a lecture, more like we're figuring it out together.
Okay, so let's dive right into that economic outlook. The Commission uses the phrase highly uncertain. That definitely catches the eye. What's behind that uncertainty?
Well, it's quite a few things stacking up, really. First, obviously, Russia's war against Ukraine is still a major factor, huge geopolitical implications, but also, ongoing risks for Europe's energy supply.
Still casting a long shadow.
Definitely. And then you add the intensified conflict in the Middle East. That brings another layer of instability, potential energy market shocks. It feels of one thing after another.
These major global events. But the forecast also mentions risks closer to home. Something about trade.
Yes, protectionism. There's a worry that protectionist measures could increase globally. And for the EU, being such an open, trade-dependent economy, well, that could really hurt.
Right, disrupt supply chains, businesses.
Exactly. And then there's an internal worry, too, about productivity.
Ah, the engine of growth. What's the concern there?
It's about persistently low productivity growth. The forecast kind of hints that if this keeps up, it gets harder for companies to afford wage increases.
Which could mean, what? Job cuts? Higher prices?
Potentially, yeah. Businesses might have to choose between reducing staff or passing costs on to consumers. Neither is great for the economy overall. It's a tricky spot.
Not ideal at all. And even the EU's big recovery plan, the RRF, might face issues.
That's another flag. Potential delays in getting those recovery and resilience facility funds out the door. Plus, looking ahead to 2026, the fiscal stance might get tighter as new budget rules kick in.
So, potential brakes on growth from different directions.
Could be. And something else the forecast mentions, which is becoming increasingly relevant, natural disasters.
Like the recent floods in Spain.
Precisely. A really stark example. These climate-linked events have massive economic costs, infrastructure damage, supply chain breaks, insurance. It's a growing economic risk factor.
So yeah, highly uncertain seems like a fair description. Okay, let's maybe zoom in a bit. How's the manufacturing sector doing amidst all this? The report says continued weakness.
It's definitely been struggling. Value-added in manufacturing basically flatlined since mid-2023. Some of the really energy-intensive sectors like metals and building materials are still finding it tough.
Even if chemicals are maybe bottoming out.
Right, chemicals might be stabilizing a bit, but others are still weak. And it's not just the heavy energy users, even less energy-intensive industries are suffering from just, well, weak demand overall.
Okay, so it's pretty widespread. What about key sectors like cars or machinery, usually EU strengths?
That's where it gets interesting. The energy shock really widened the cost gap, Energy is just more expensive in the EU compared to the US or parts of Asia now.
Ah, so a direct competitive disadvantage.
A big one, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially for industries like car making or machine building that compete globally, makes it harder to match prices.
And demand itself is an issue, too.
Absolutely. Central banks everywhere have been tightening policy, raising interest rates. That cools demand for big-ticket investment goods, the kind of machinery, transport equipment, tech components the EU exports a lot of.
So lower orders, less revenue for those core export industries.
Exactly. And add to that a downturn in construction.
Which means less demand for building materials.
Right. Another hit for manufacturers. And then there's the whole structural shift happening in the car industry.
The move to EVs, electric vehicles.
Yeah. And frankly, EU manufacturers, maybe particularly in Germany, are finding it hard to keep pace with the speed and scale of EV production elsewhere. It's a massive transition, and it's proving challenging. Especially tough for Germany, given its reliance on both energy-intensive and export-heavy manufacturing.
A perfect storm of challenges for manufacturing, it seems. Okay, let's switch gears to the labor market. On the surface, the news looks pretty good, right? Record low unemployment.
That is the headline, yes. EU unemployment hit 6.0% in Q2 2024, a record low, dropped again to 5.9% in September. Euro area was 6.3%. Pretty low numbers.
And across different countries, still big gaps.
While there are differences, sure, Spain's still high at 11.3%, Czechia very low at 2.7%, but actually the gap between countries, the dispersion, has been narrowing, and broader measures of labor market slack are also down. So yeah, it looks tight.
Okay, but you said on the surface, what's the catch?
Well, if you look at job vacancy rates, how many open jobs there are, comparing Q2 2024 to the year before, vacancies actually decreased in several big sectors: industry, construction, retail. So fewer openings in some key areas, right, but they increased in others like IT, information, and communication. So it suggests demand for labor is shifting, not uniformly strong everywhere.
Interesting. So maybe cooling down in some places, heating up in others. And how does that tie into wages?
The report links this. Nominal wage growth, also varies across sectors. It suggests that even though the overall market looks tight, it doesn't automatically mean strong wage increases for everyone everywhere. It's more fragmented.
Right, a more nuanced picture than just the headline unemployment rate. Okay, let's talk inflation. Always a hot topic. What's the latest forecast?
The main message seems to be that the strong downward push we saw from non-energy goods prices, that's probably going to fade.
Meaning prices for those goods won't keep falling as fast or might level off?
Pretty much. Look at food inflation that came down, but then actually ticked up again in October. That's despite commodity prices easing and no major pressure in the supply chain.
Huh. And industrial goods.
Similar story, in a way. Inflation for non-energy industrial goods has fallen quite broadly across different types, probably due to strong international competition and just weaker demand.
So some relief there, but maybe we're reaching a floor.
That seems to be the implication. The report notes that inflation for both food and industrial goods is now getting close to pre-pandemic averages. So there might just not be much room for them to pull the headline inflation rate down further.
Right, the easy gains might be over. The report mentions underlying inflation too.
Briefly, yeah. Those indicators tried to filter out the volatile stuff, like energy and food, to see the more persistent trends. It's all part of trying to figure out where inflation is truly headed.
Makes sense. Okay, shifting to government finances. The EU deficit is apparently shrinking in 2024. What's driving that? Spending cuts.
Actually, no. It's mainly driven by revenues this year. The overall EU revenue to GDP ratio is expected to go up, partly thanks to some unexpected revenue windfalls.
So governments are taking in more money. What about spending?
Spending to GDP is also projected to rise slightly, but that's mostly because of higher interest payments on existing government debt.
Rising rates biting there too. What about the next couple of years, 2025, 2026?
For 2025, revenues are projected to grow again. Think more transfers from the EU budget, some national policy measures. Spending also keeps rising, mainly due to more RRF-funded projects coming online.
Okay, so both up in 2025, then.
Then in 2026, based on current policies, the forecast suggests a slight dip in the revenue ratio, maybe some shortfalls. But the expenditure ratio is expected to come down a bit as, hopefully, economic conditions improve. It's all quite interconnected.
A lot of moving parts in those budgets. Okay, let's look outwards now. EU-India relations. The report sounds quite optimistic.
It does. It talks about substantial potential to deepen economic ties. A big part of that is the ongoing negotiation for a free trade agreement, an FTA.
How's that going?
They had the 9th round of talks back in September 2024. The hope is it will boost trade in goods and services, obviously, but also foster more cooperation on things like clean energy, smart cities, sustainable transport.
So it's broader than just tariffs and quotas.
Oh, definitely. The idea is to reduce trade barriers, sure, but also align regulations more closely, which makes business easier. And beyond the FTA itself, there's already stronger collaboration on climate change, sustainable development, the digital economy.
And potential in green tech as India decarbonizes.
Exactly. Huge scope there for collaboration on renewables, electric vehicles, energy efficiency. It looks like a relationship with a lot of room to grow, mutually beneficial.
Sounds promising. Now, the forecast have one of those special topics on productivity versus employment growth, a potential trade-off. What's that about?
Yeah, it's looking at the last decade or so. We've seen pretty steady job growth in the EU, which is good. But labor productivity growth has, well, slowed down a bit.
So more people working, but each worker isn't necessarily becoming much more productive.
Kind of, yeah. And the analysis tries to figure out why. Interestingly, it suggests it's not because the workforce composition changed dramatically, like having more educated or experienced workers hasn't prevented the slowdown.
Oh. I might have assumed a more skilled workforce would automatically boost productivity.
You'd think, wouldn't you?
Uh,
But the data here suggests other factors are more dominant. Also, workers moving between sectors. That hasn't had a huge impact on the overall productivity trend either.
so if it's not workforce skills or people changing industries, what is driving it?
The report argues it's mostly down to dynamics within specific sectors, intrasector dynamics, they call.
Okay. Meaning what exactly? Inside the companies or industries?
It seems to point towards relatively sluggish investment. Companies have been hiring, yes, because employment growth was strong and wage increases were somewhat restrained, but maybe they haven't been investing enough in the new tech or processes that really boost output per worker.
Hiring over investing in efficiency.
That seems to be part of the story. Plus, weaker growth in total factor productivity, which is kind of a measure of overall efficiency and innovation, suggests maybe slower adoption of new tech, less dynamism.
So, underinvestment and maybe slower innovation are key suspects. The report also mentioned shifts in who is getting employed, right? More women, older workers.
Yes, over the last decade, say 2013 to 2023, compared to the decade before that, a larger share of the job growth came from women, workers over 55, and people with university degrees.
How does that connect to productivity?
Well, the report also notes that since around 2002, quite a bit of the employment growth has been in sectors that generally have lower levels of labor productivity to begin with. So the type of jobs being created might also play a role.
So, a complex picture. Workforce changes, sector shifts, but the core issue seems to be investment and innovation within those sectors. Okay, let's widen the lens again. Thinking about the EU's place in the world, its history, drawing on those other sources now, how does the EU stack up globally?
Economically is huge. Nominal GDP in 2024 was around, 17.9 trillion? That's about a sixth of the global total.
Wow. And population-wise?
A much smaller share. Only about 5.5% of the world population in 2023. So punching above its weight economically.
And it's way more than just an economic bloc, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. You've got the customs union, the single market aiming for that free movement of people, goods, services, capital. Standardized laws are key there.
Plus common policies on lots of other things.
Right. Justice, home affairs, trade deals, farming, fishing, regional funding. Then there's the Schengen area, no passport checks internally for most.
Yeah.
And the Eurozone, 20 countries using the euro. It's deep integration.
And on the world stage. Politically.
Increasingly significant. Through the Common Foreign and Security Policy, it has diplomatic missions, represents members in the UN, WTO, G7, G20. Some even call it an emerging superpower.
And it won the Nobel Peace Prize back in 2012.
It did. Of course, the UK left in 2020. That was a major event. But there's still about 10 countries hoping to join.
It's constantly evolving. Where did it all start? The name Europe, the idea.
Well, Europe goes back to Greek myth and geography. The modern push for integration really kicked off after World War II, around 1948. Treaty of Brussels, the OECE for the Marshall Plan aid, the Hague Congress pushing for unity, leading to the Council of Europe.
But the real seed of today's EU was the Schuman Declaration, right? Coal and steel.
Exactly, 1950. That led to the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC, in 52. Just 6 countries initially: France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg.
Why coal and steel?
Because they were the essential ingredients for war back then. The idea was, if you pool control over coal and steel, you make war between members, especially France and Germany, materially impossible. It was fundamental. And the ECSC laid the groundwork for the Commission, the Parliament.
And from there, a series of treaties built the EU we know.
Precisely. The Treaty of Rome in 57 created the European Economic Community, broadening cooperation. Then the Single European Act in 86, Maastricht in 93, that's when it officially became the European Union, followed by Amsterdam, Nice, Lisbon. Each one deepening integration, changing how it works.
And setting up the main institutions. Commission, Council, Parliament, Court of Justice.
That's the core structure, yes. It's been quite a journey.
Absolutely. Okay, let's bring it back to the present day, but focus on the social side now. Using that ETUI report from 2023, what are the key social policy trends?
A big thing the report highlights is how social goals are getting more integrated into economic planning, specifically through these fiscal structural plans, or FSPs, under the Revised Stability and Growth Pact.
How does that work?
Basically, all member states now have to include plans for social reforms and investments in their medium-term budget plans. These need to tackle challenges identified in the European semester process and align with big EU priorities.
Like the green transition, digital skills.
Exactly. Green and digital transitions, social resilience. Think the European pillar of social rights, energy security, even defense capabilities. It's about linking the economic and social dimensions more explicitly.
Trying to ensure budgets support social goals, too. The report also mentioned some disagreements between the Council and Parliament on the new fiscal rules.
Yes, particularly around surveillance. The Council, representing member state governments, seemed to want maybe less power for national independent budget watchdogs and more for the European Fiscal Board. They also pushed for some flexibility linked to recovery fund spending and temporarily excluding higher interest costs from deficit calculations.
And the Parliament's take.
The European Parliament wanted clearer rules on what happens if countries deviate from spending targets, but also, crucially, more flexibility to increase spending during downturns. And they proposed allowing deviations for strategic investments in those common EU priorities we just mentioned.
So, the usual tension between fiscal discipline and the need for investment and flexibility. What about green industrial policy, the Green Deal Industrial Plan? Social implications.
That's a key point in the ETUI report. The EU's pushing this plan GDIP with its pillars on regulation, funding, skills, trade. But the report raises concerns that the social side, particularly the European Pillar of Social Rights, isn't explicitly integrated enough.
A risk of focusing too much on the industrial and not enough on the just transition.
That's the worry. The argument is for a more holistic approach where climate goals and social welfare goals are pursued together, ensuring fairness. Trade unions are seen as key partners in making that happen.
Makes sense. The report also mentions specific health and safety issues, carcinogens at work.
Yes, the revision of the Carcinogens Directive was a big deal. It finished in 2022. And the numbers are stark. Something like 53% of work-related deaths in the EU are linked to cancers. Over 100,000 preventable deaths a year.
Shocking statistic.
It really is. And it hits less privileged groups harder. So strengthening that directive, making it cover carcinogens, mutagens, and reprotoxic substances, the CMRD was vital for worker protection.
And the pandemic's impact. Teleworking.
Huge impact. Telework is clearly here to stay, but it raises questions about health and safety rules. There are psychosocial risks, issues around work-life balance, inequalities based on housing or equipment, especially for women often juggling care duties.
Did they update the rules for it?
Well, they tried. Negotiations on updating the EU agreement on telework, which could have led to a directive, actually broke down in late 2023. Employers rejected the compromise. So the unions are now pushing the Commission to propose legislation itself.
A gap there then. What about minimum wages? The report called the EU directive a milestone.
It really is seen that way. Adopted in October 2022, it's the first EU law aiming to ensure adequate minimum wages and, importantly, strengthen collective bargaining across all member states.
A shift towards a more social EU.
It represents that, yes, a move away from pure market focus. Member states have 2 years to implement it, though it's worth noting Denmark has challenged it in court, but it's generally expected to stand.
Okay, so potentially significant. What about safety nets? Minimum income support, homelessness?
On minimum income, the report says levels haven't really kept pace, often aren't enough to prevent poverty, and vary hugely between countries. There was a non-binding council recommendation in early 2023, but many are calling for a binding EU directive for common minimum standards.
And homelessness?
A major concern. Rising housing costs, lack of affordable and social housing. The EU has pledged to end homelessness by 2030, launched a platform, EPOCH, but the core problem of housing availability and affordability is a massive hurdle.
So policy initiatives exist, but the scale of the problems is huge. Any other social policy points?
The report touches on ongoing debates about Europe's future, the impact of the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, the Czech EU presidency focusing on social issues, progress on the European Disability Card, and Parking Card, which is great for recognizing status across borders.
Oh, good. That sounds useful.
Yeah, agreement was reached on those early in 2024. And also talks about revising the European Works Council Directive, aiming to boost worker consultation rights in multinationals. That's also moving forward, with a Commission proposal out and discussions underway.
So a really broad social agenda, constantly interacting with the economic and political climate.
Absolutely. Complex and always evolving.
It is definitely a lot to take in. But hopefully this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of the economic currents and social policies really shaping the EU right now.
We've covered that economic uncertainty, the manufacturing headwinds, the tight but complicated labor market, inflation's path.
The deficit picture, the potential with India, that productivity puzzle, and the whole landscape of social policy developments.
Yeah, the goal was really just to pull out the key threads from all those sources, make it understandable, give you that solid foundation without drowning you in policy details.
Right. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Given everything we've discussed, these economic challenges, the social responses, what do you think is the single biggest challenge facing the European Union in the coming years? And maybe more importantly, what kind of policies do you think would actually work best to tackle it?
No easy answers there, for sure.
Definitely not. But it's the central question, really, for Europe's future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.